One of the things that you mentioned earlier was the fact that China might surpass the United States in investment in Africa. What is generally the reaction of the African countries to the influx of Chinese investors? Is there tension there? Would they rather see the U.S. step into that role?
Well, do I think they would rather see the U.S.? Yes, they would. But the U.S. is not stepping up. There's a number of reasons for that. China, I think, will pass us up. All the predictions are that this year they'll probably pass us up. We won't know that for sure until UNCTAD's figures are out in 2012, but I think it'll show that in 2010 China became a larger investor. They're much broadly invested. There's a number of reasons. They provide, in a lot of ways, I think their entry is very good. They're providing infrastructure that did not exist before. They're providing large agricultural tracts that did not exist before. They're helping Africa in a lot of ways. Against that, though, is that a lot of the agribusiness is being shipped out that they're building. So it's not necessarily helping alleviate poverty in Africa. It's not necessarily feeding Africa. It's feeding their own population. The other issue is that, well, there's two other issues. But another issue is that they bring their own workforce primarily, and that's becoming a very big concern throughout Africa. But they also support financing, and I'll come to that in a second. But bringing their own workforce is a major issue. You now see places like Gabon, supposedly, with 1.5 million people, have 100,000 Chinese. That's a very large input. There's going to be, I think, all kinds of social pressures. And the Chinese really haven't developed workforce among the Africans. They're not necessarily bringing a lot more jobs. So there's that. The third point that I think is a problem with China is, in fact, it does go to the corruption issue. They are taking Africa as it is. And so the pressures for change, for greater transparency, are now off a lot of the African leadership that OECD countries and others had placed on them for change. The AGOA status of the U.S. was really also not simply a trade mechanism, but it was a mechanism for improved governance. Those pressures for improved governance are off now because the Chinese say you don't have to do any of this. We'll provide the things that nobody else is providing for you. So that's a major problem.
Are the U.S. companies hindered in their competitiveness because of
absolutely.
They have to adhere to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
There's no doubt about it. They can't compete. Now, another reason they can't compete, could they compete? Yes. We don't provide the financing for our companies, and this is where I think the U.S. government has to become much more active and work with the private sector. We don't provide, the U.S. government, the Export-Import Bank, does not provide financing for U.S. companies investing in Africa. If you take...
Just across the board, a blanket?
Across the board. Let me tell you. The Chinese Exim Bank for Africa, in 2008, the last figure's out, provided $13.2 billion of guaranteed loans for Chinese companies. The American Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank of the United States, provided $437 million of guarantees. Now, out of those guarantees, you take the 5 largest companies for which they guaranteed, which are totally, totally safe. Now, remember that XM is to help lower risk. Boeing, General Electric, Westinghouse, Chevron, and Exxon. The pipeline. Those are totally non-risk guarantees. And so there's less than $100 million. So you contrast $13.1 billion for companies who want to invest in Africa versus $100 million for companies. It's very hard to compete. We could compete if the U.S. if the U.S. government is a public-private cooperation. The Marshall Plan worked for Europe because private sector and public sector got together, they sat at the same table and planned things out.